And yeah, thanks everyone for coming and joining tonight. I'm really sorry that you're listening to a white British male do a talk on decolonising vaccines. I'm probably not exactly the most appropriate person to be doing this. So yeah, I mean, we were hoping that Maureen would be able to make it along tonight. It looks like she's not going to be able to. But yeah, I mean, she's going to be in the UK next week. So hopefully, if any of you are in Leicester, Manchester, Newcastle, Stirling, or anywhere close, then you'd have the opportunity to see her personally. But I appreciate that might not be easy for everybody. But yeah, so I mean, to start off, I suppose, I mean, we've been working on this issue around vaccine inequality and the complete failure of the world to provide vaccines in an equitable way, and to make sure that people in the global south especially are protected against COVID-19. And we've been working with a few organisations, including Universities Allied for Essential Medicines, Just Treatment, and Students for Global Health, to put on this tour, because we think it's, this is a really, this is one of the pressing issues of our time, and as we, as we're warned repeatedly that this is likely not to be the only pandemic, in our lifetimes. It's one which we need to. Well, it's one that we can't underestimate, and as we know from cases of COVID ticking up in the UK even now, it's certain that the pandemic threat is certainly not over here, and it hasn't been over at any point in many parts of the world, which are still protected. So yeah, so we wanted to organise this talk called Decolonising Vaccines. So I suppose, I mean, the talk that I prepared tonight was to largely address this question of what do we mean when we talk about decolonising vaccines, and what does it mean to say that the pharmaceutical system and the pandemic response, as it has been, is colonial. So I'm going to speak to that issue tonight. So I think one ways of looking at a colonial regime is obviously to look at it in terms of the impacts upon people, but also in terms of the concentration of manufacturing. So we know that during the pandemic it's been revealed, or it's been made harshly clear, just how deeply concentrated manufacturing of essential medicines has been in the global north. It's been made abundantly clear just how significant to your likelihood to get vaccinated the country that you are based in is. It's shown the economic power of rich countries in a pandemic, and it's also revealed the structure, sort of corporate structure of companies which deprioritize lives in the global south, putting profits first, putting profits ahead of lives at every stage. So I think we've all seen, anyone who's been following this issue has seen how rich countries bought up the supply from the beginning of the pandemic. Most of the pharmaceutical companies provided 1%, maybe 2% of their vaccines in 2021 to low-income countries, and only 14% of people in low-income countries have received a single jab today, while 55% of people have received boosters in the UK. So without wanting to just carry on throwing loads of numbers at you, more people have received boosters in the rich world than have received jabs in total in low-income countries. And the pandemic's seen sort of the consolidation of these sort of pharmaceutical oligarchies in many ways. So we've seen, even as there has been this complete failure to provide vaccines to people in large parts of the world, pharmaceutical companies have been churning out record profits. So Pfizer's vaccine made $37 billion last year in revenue, and that's just their vaccine. And that revenue was basically the same as Pfizer's entire annual revenue the previous year. So it's basically doubled their annual revenue. There's been 40 new billionaires created from the pandemic, from vaccines, treatments, PPE, and other equipment. And the biggest 3 vaccine companies, so Pfizer, BioNTech, and Moderna, have been making $1,000 a second in profit during the pandemic. So these are really, really quite eye-watering figures. And then at the same time as we're seeing this disparity, this complete failure to make sure that the world is vaccinated, coupled with the really quite immense profiteering of pharmaceutical companies, we're also seeing that rich countries are better able to emerge from the crisis. So not only are you having inequalities in health, but we're seeing more of a divergence economically as well, as rich countries, and obviously we can question the way that countries like our own have unlocked, but ultimately, obviously, a nation which is better able to vaccinate a large proportion of its people will be better prepared to reopen its economy. So where schools were closed for practically, I think, a year in places like Uganda, we saw school closures, but we also saw different, obviously it was an online teaching environment was slightly easier to create. But we're also seeing the restarting of the economy in places like the UK. Meanwhile, there's been growing debt in the global south, as countries haven't been able to finance the health demands that COVID-19 has placed upon them. And then, so I suppose we talk about those as the sort of raw statistics, and the sort of inequality as a symptom of the colonial model. But I think we should also look at the way that the West, I suppose, has responded. And I think fundamentally in that respect, it's been a neo-colonial response. So I think at the very beginning of the pandemic, there was this hope that we might see a bit of a collaborative response. We might see scientists, pharmaceutical companies, other experts coming together to pool their knowledge in the interest of the greater good. And I think we knew, or it was certainly, these expectations were to a certain degree founded on a hope that Western nations would find it pragmatic to work together, that they would find it pragmatic to pool resources, to find cures, to find vaccines for COVID-19. Knowing as we did that some vaccines might succeed, some might fail, it would make sense for scientists to come together, pool that knowledge, and make sure that every advance was built on. It didn't appear to be a system ripe for competition, for capitalist competition. But that did not materialize. So while in the early days of the pandemic, the World Health Organization proposed this sort of technology sharing pool, CTAP, the COVID Technology Access Pool, in which scientists and companies would put their blueprints, put their technology and know-how. It didn't receive a single bit of information basically in its first year. And it was only in December last year that a Spanish research company submitted a test, like a diagnostic, to CTAP for that technology to be shared. Companies like Pfizer labeled this mechanism nonsense, and I quote there because that is the word that they used. Albert Bourla, the CEO of Pfizer, was clearly against this, and as we know, this is in large part because these companies saw a fantastic opportunity to make a huge amount of profit. So instead, what we saw was what is essentially a fairly neo-colonial model of charity, and even on the sort of basic terms of charity, it failed actually. but still, so there was this body called COVAX, which was to essentially act as a vaccine distribution mechanism. Now, COVAX has had very many issues since it started trying to distribute vaccines, but fundamentally, again, on the raw numbers, it's failed abysmally. It aimed to take a huge number of donations from high-income countries and distribute 2 billion vaccines by the end of 2021. However, by that point, it had distributed around 700 million, so around just over a third of its target. So really quite small numbers here. And when you consider the global need and the fact as well, obviously, that it's not just a matter of getting these 2 billion vaccines to people at some point. Clearly in a pandemic, urgency is really important, and every delay there has meant lives lost. So what we've essentially had is a display of former colonial powers handing out scraps to countries, and it really has in many senses been as bad as that. Often it's been vaccines which have been, if not rejected, deprioritized in rich countries. So Pfizer really was very reluctant to put any support into into COVAX. Moderna has given practically nothing. And yeah, most of the vaccines distributed through COVAX were AstraZeneca, which while I think a lot of the concern that was spread around AstraZeneca was perhaps overboard. These vaccines were still received in countries in global south by people and governments sort of knowing that they weren't the priority vaccines for those in the global north. And they were also distributed late often. We've seen countless vaccines delivered that have been going out of date, which were delivered in a haphazard manner, which prepared countries very little for their arrival. So countries, having received very few vaccines, would suddenly receive, huge splurges of doses, but understandably wouldn't be prepared, but then would be blamed for having to bin them. So again, it's been this vaccine rollout at a pace dictated by countries in the global north, with very little supportive participation from those rich corporations of the global north. So it was really understandable and really to be expected that countries in the global south saw this coming, essentially. So even before the rollout of vaccines started in December 2020 in the UK, India and South Africa proposed a structural solution, one which would hopefully mean they didn't have to rely on charity, and one which meant they might gain more autonomy over their own vaccine rollouts. So what they proposed was that intellectual property on COVID-19 vaccines, therapeutics and tests would be waived for the duration of the pandemic. And the idea behind this was that if you suspend the intellectual property and you give countries and companies in the global south access to some of the trade secrets and some of the data, which is sort of stored in according to these intellectual property laws, then it will be possible for them to make vaccines in the global south. They argued that there is existing manufacturing capacity to enable them to do this, and rightly they predicted that the vaccine rollout globally would be deeply unequal and one which would prioritise the global north, which would pay higher, which would be able to pay higher prices for it, basically. So this proposal, which was centred at the World Trade Organization, was made in October 2020, and then for the last sort of 15 months, there's been wranglings over these discussions. But over 130 countries support this TRIPS waiver, so the majority of countries in the world. Most Commonwealth countries support it, and there's just been a few holdouts. Even the United States has come to support a waiver on vaccines, if not on treatments and tests. And as my colleague Nick likes to say, it's the first time that one of Global Justice Now, one of Global Justice Now's campaigns has had the support of the US president. So it's not insignificant. That was a really sort of significant move, and we can talk perhaps later about developments in this TRIPS process if people are interested, because it has been in the news a little bit in the last few days. But yeah, so the response to this proposal was, you know, for most parts of the world, was very supportive. However, the UK has been one of those countries that has continued to block it. The EU likewise has continued to block, with Germany leading the charge there, Germany being the host of BioNTech, and Switzerland as well has been a key blocker. It's also been accompanied by sort of often quite racist assumptions about what this intellectual property waiver could achieve, and what technology transfer could achieve. So we've seen at least one pharma CEO coming out and saying that he didn't see that technology transfer to countries where mRNA vaccines were being produced was a viable option. In most cases, I think he suggested that maybe Australia might be an option. He suggested that they had the existing capacity there, and by implication that that most other countries did not have that capacity. But this sort of argument that there isn't the capacity in the global south has been proven wrong time and time again, and it's really quite shocking that it's taken organisations like NGOs and newspapers to do the research on this. But certainly the New York Times came out in autumn last year saying that it had found, I think, 10 companies around the world, not just around the world, 10 companies in Latin America, Africa and Asia that could produce mRNA vaccines if there was an intellectual property waiver, and if there was tech transfer. Meanwhile, it was found, Human Rights Watch and MSF found that there are over 120 countries in those same continents, 120 companies in those same continents that could be producing mRNA vaccines. So this sort of assumption that we do have this sort of zero-sum game of manufacture and production is fundamentally a false one, and one which has been propagated, I suppose, to maintain the status quo and maintain the dominance of the pharmaceutical companies, and with the full backing of the nations that host them. So manufacturing, while obviously, as we know, India has produced a large number, a huge number of AstraZeneca vaccines, concentration has continued to be in the US, North America, and in Europe. And I think we know as well, and one of the really key points about this, one of the key things to highlight in this failure to make sure everybody gets a vaccine is it's not just a question of where medicines are produced, but who has control over that production as well. And that's a really key point when we're talking about decolonising vaccine production. So it's, again, there are moves by companies like BioNTech and Moderna to make plans to produce vaccines in African countries. There's been a slew of recent announcements as these companies try to at least put a positive spin on their failure to do so previously, and their failure to get vaccines to low-income countries and countries in Africa as well. But a lot of these efforts are aimed, we see it, to retain to keep the control by these companies over production. And I think there was one example early on in the pandemic which showed just how important it is not just to have production on the continent, as important as that can be for technology transfer. If these companies are hiring and training local workers, clearly that's better than just doing it in Europe or the US. but it's certainly not enough. So we saw last year in South Africa, Johnson & Johnson has been working with Aspen, a factory there. And even as South Africa was starting to have a really serious second wave of COVID, that Johnson & Johnson factory that was producing vaccines in South Africa was exporting them to Europe at the same time. So even while people were dying in South Africa, vaccines were being exported. So it's not just a matter of where vaccines are produced, but about who has control over them. I think that's a really telling example there. So yeah, I mean, and to say as well, this issue of the sort of the concentration of wealth and power in the global north and the failure of the pharmaceutical system to prioritize the needs and the lives of people in the global south is not new. This is an issue that was a problem long before the pandemic. And if things don't change drastically, it will continue to be. So we saw in the late 90s, when South Africa was in the midst of the peak of the HIV and AIDS crisis, South Africa, Nelson Mandela of South Africa, tried to pass a law that would allow it to import generic antiretroviral drugs to treat the disease, and to allow South Africa to produce generics itself as well. The response of pharmaceutical companies to that was to join up and to try to sue Mandela's government to prevent them from doing that. South Africa actually never changed its intellectual property, its apartheid era intellectual property laws, and it was a movement of people on the streets in South Africa and internationally that eventually meant that South Africa started making the compulsory licenses, which allowed for the import of cheaper HIV drugs. So that was a evidence of the sort of long time nefariousness of these industries, but also of the fact that through popular pressure, change can happen. There's so many ways of illustrating just how little the pharmaceutical industry, as it is, caters to the priorities of the global south. Just one example, in the last 40 years, there's been 14 new treatments created for hay fever, compared to 2 new treatments for tuberculosis, a disease which kills 1.5 million people a year. I mean, it's really staggering. 4% of funding goes to neglected tropical diseases, which kill 185,000 people per year. Yeah, I mean, these numbers are just shocking, and they're symptomatic of a really broken industry. And I think it's worth saying as well, and I think it's important for us when we're campaigning in the UK to have a domestic angle too. But studies have shown that even for if we're thinking sort of selfishly in the global north, more than half of approved medicines in recent years were just modified versions of existing medicines and didn't offer any additional health benefits. And we know as well that pharma companies often spend more on sales and marketing than they do on research and development. So the priority for spending and the inefficiency in spending is huge. And obviously the fact that such a lot of money is being spent on sales and marketing tells you, again, all you need to know about how much some of these drugs are needed if they don't sell themselves. So yeah, this model isn't working. And the drive to protect it at all costs doesn't make sense for anybody except pharmaceutical companies. And I've not spoken yet tonight about the amount of publicly funded research that went into all of these vaccines. Again, there's been huge amounts, I'm sure, but it's something which is true of the industry, beyond COVID. Again, 40% of investment in the UK into research and development of pharmaceutical tools is publicly funded or funded by charities. We know that Moderna's vaccine was 95–97% publicly funded. AstraZeneca, similar. We know that even as Pfizer protests that it didn't receive much money from the US government to bring its vaccine to market, it received huge advance purchase orders, basically money in advance saying we will buy your vaccine No matter how many others are on the market. And we also know that the mRNA technology that Pfizer used was based on decades of research funded by the US government, basically. That came off the back of attempts to create an HIV vaccine using mRNA technology. So it's got decades of public research behind it, and there were opportunities to put more conditions on this, conditions for a people's vaccine. On efforts to decolonize, I think it's really important because I've talked a lot about what's been wrong so far. Clearly, the push for the patent waiver is one of the key demands of countries in the global south for decolonizing vaccines and the pharmaceutical industry more broadly. One of the other really inspiring examples that's sort of really taken off in the last few months has been attempts starting in South Africa to build new vaccine hubs, to build mRNA hubs. So the World Health Organization has basically supported a company in South Africa, Afrigen, to reverse engineer the Moderna vaccine. Now they've asked, they've demanded of Pfizer and Moderna that they share their recipes, their blueprints, their know-how, so that they can scale up production. These companies have given them a flat no, but rather than giving up, they've said, to hell with you, we'll do it ourselves. And they've now managed to create a successful copy of that vaccine. There's still quite a long way to go. They've got to scale up production to commercial levels, and there'll be regulatory loopholes to jump through as well. But it's a really significant step, because now that technology, is being created in South Africa. There are plans to expand those hubs to 9 more countries to make sure that vaccines, treatments, and tests for COVID-19 and beyond can be created in more countries around the world, and to essentially decentralize, democratize, and to decolonize this really deeply monopolistic and centralized pharmaceutical system. And the significance of this as well is that this mRNA technology could be used to produce treatments for many diseases beyond COVID-19. It's a very adaptable technology and has been earmarked for treatments for malaria, cystic fibrosis, HIV, and more. The pharma industry, however, continues to try to undermine these hubs. For example, there's a foundation called KENUP, which has been acting on behalf of BioNTech in parts of Africa, which has been lobbying the South African government and the EU hard for effectively the termination of this independent hub. And meanwhile, these companies making their sort of making small investments in manufacturing, but retaining a lot of the control, are also examples of sort of their intent to maintain control over production in Africa. But nonetheless, it is a really inspiring example of what can be done, and it's one that needs our solidarity and support. There's a few other examples as well, which I can talk about if we have time. I'm conscious that we might want to go to questions if we've got 25 minutes left. But I think it's worth noting as well that the Cuba model of vaccine production also has shown us a different way of producing vaccines and of distributing them during the pandemic. So Cuba has obviously invested heavily in its biotech industry over the years, and it is an example of what a strong public health sector and a very driven public investment policy can produce when it prioritizes health outcomes. So Cuba has created 5 vaccine candidates, of which 2 are already in operation. It's got some of the highest vaccination rates in the world, and Cuba has started exporting its technology to other countries and selling those vaccines cheaply as well. And I think these cases, the South Africa case, the Cuba case, there's another case of a children's hospital in Texas that created a vaccine, which it says will remain profit-free and patent-free, which show and really respond directly to the argument, which is often made by pharmaceutical companies and by our government here in the UK, that profit is necessary in order to incentivize innovation. And it's clear this is a complete myth. And we know that sort of most of the scientists working on this are not doing this in order to make major profits. And actually, it's the structure of these companies and their sort of monopoly control over this knowledge, which creates this system. It's not necessary for innovation. Yeah, I think that's all been really clear. And again, to say as well, there's huge precedent for this as well. From time to time, it can feel like you're saying things which are so outside the realm of neoliberal modern capitalist common sense that we forget that this was actually very normal behavior until relatively recently. So for the invention of penicillin, the US compelled drug companies to share its trade secrets to advance that with huge success. Similarly for smallpox, the World Health Organization pooled vaccine know-how and used that know-how to create a better vaccine. And we saw it for polio as well. That vaccine was not patented. So we've seen that it's been possible before. We've seen that various companies, countries, organizations are making it possible again. What we need to do now is make sure that it's possible into the future, and that all of these new initiatives can flourish and have our backing and solidarity. So I will stop there because I'm conscious it's a good job that we don't have more in that sense, because I've spoken on for far too long. I can see there's one question in the chat, but I will hand back over to the chair.
Thank you very much.